Hello everyone and welcome to week 6 of Toontown School House. If you are currently in the lecture voice chat, make sure to go ahead and head over to twitch.tv/Benjamin8693 to see the visuals for today's lecture. The link to that is currently in the announcements channel, so make sure to head over there, watch the stream, to have a look at my screen. You can mute the audio on Twitch, just listen to me on Discord, that's perfectly fine. Or if you're watching on YouTube, then you can just watch the video, and that's great. Alright, so you may have noticed we have a different format for the slideshows today. Instead of that orange and blue mess, now we have blue and purple, and I think it looks much better. This is mainly because I had a team drive that I bought off of eBay, like a very bootleg team drive access, and I put all the slideshows on there. And what I would do is I would reference the first few lecture slideshows in order to make the other ones. Good old copy paste and change text. But all of them were deleted, so I only have the PDFs for them now instead of the original, like, actual files, which sucks. So I decided, you know what, I might as well go ahead and spruce up the theme a little bit. So welcome to week 6. Alright, yep, so again, make sure you're watching my Twitch channel right now to see the visuals for today's lecture, to see the slideshow. Alright, so what did we talk about last week? Well, last week, and it was actually a week ago because last week's lecture was also on Sunday. Last week we talked about event handlers. We talked about sending and listening. We talked about these 3 functions right here: self.accept, self.accept once, messenger.send. The first 2 are the listeners, and the third one was the sender. We talked about how they interact with each other, how you can send different messages throughout the code in order to make different things happen. And there were many examples of event handlers. So whenever you press the control key or the arrow keys to make your tune move and jump, that's an event handler. Whenever you press the end key or the home key to open up your tune task menu or the gag screen, that's an event handler. But they're not just for key presses, they're for other things too. Whenever you walk up to an NPC, such as Fisherman Freddy, he has an invisible collision around him, and when you walk up to that collision, a function happens and you request to interact with him, and that's how you can sell your fish to Fisherman Freddy. And another example is the VP. The VP's little cage area. So this little undercarriage area. Whenever you throw a pie, it has a collision on it, and the VP's undercarriage also has a collision, and if the 2 intercept each other, then that is considered a stun to the VP. So these are many different examples of uses. Event handlers are really just used all the time. Boss battles, NPCs, interface, movement, they're pretty much used everywhere. You're always going to use event handlers. This is also an example. This is a scrapped example that I really liked last week. In Toontown 2002, before they had Toon HQs, the burg looked like this. It had an igloo where the HQ used to be. An igloo that you could just walk in. And a piece of scrapped code that still exists in the Toontown source up until 2013, when the game closed, was some code that would stop the snow in the burg whenever you would go inside of the igloo. So in the burg, it's generally snowing. And when you go inside, of course, you don't want it to keep snowing on your screen because you're underneath cover, and that wouldn't make any sense. So pretty much what the event handlers would do is it would detect when you are inside of the igloo, and when you are, it would stop the snow, and when you left the igloo, it would start the snow back up. And also, Darth Nihilus asked Is the Igloo model still in the face files? No, unfortunately not. Or else it would be added to offline immediately as a beta playground. So no, there is no Igloo. And the example we gave in the lecture, we did a few examples, but this was just one of them, where you could walk up to a crate and then your toon would comment on the scenery. It was a pretty simple collision event handler. We also did some other examples, but I'm only going to show this one. Alright, so before we move on to today's lecture, are there any questions anyone has regarding last week, whether it be event handlers or something else you may have been stuck on regarding them? Hunter Boppin said, how do you select a collision if you place multiple of the same prop? That's a good question. So there's a few different ways you could do that. I'm not going to get into all of them now. I can explain a few of them. I believe there's a way you can rename collisions through code as you're loading the model. Forgot how to do that though. I wouldn't worry yourself with that. Another way you could find a specific collision is by changing the where you find the collision, I believe. Something like that would work. There's a few different ways you could do it. I could probably show you a specific way after today's lecture, because I do see your issue. Like if you have multiple crates, but you only want one of the crates to run something, then that is something you would have to worry about. Deputy Wacko asked, are event handlers used for cutscenes? Example, the money bin cutscene in Toontown Offline. They're sort of used. Basically, the episode system in Toontown Offline is very similar to the tutorial system, and how they both work is when you load into the zone, so if you load into the tutorial or if you load into the episode, what happens is the game waits until your toon confirms that it's in the zone before it plays the cutscene. So in the tutorial, it has a cutscene where Mickey or Minnie walks out, introduces you to Tutorial Tom. In the episodes, it'll just play the whatever episode cutscene it is. And basically, when your toon enters the zone and is fully loaded into the zone, your toon will actually send a message, and that message will be routed through the server, and then eventually the cutscene will start. That's only to make sure that you are 100% loaded in before the cutscene starts. Otherwise, you might run into issues where you're not all the way loaded, but the cutscene's starting, and then you may crash. So yeah, event handlers are used in episodes and in the tutorial. Alright, are there any more questions, or can we move on? Alright, I think I can move on. I'm just waiting to see what people are typing. Oh no, I have 17. Whoopsies. I do have water, Hunter Bobbin. Okay. So, let's move on to the showcase for this week. I've pulled a few images from the showcase channel, and we're just going to show off some people's work. There was less than last week, definitely, so I added a little bit of fluff at the end, and you'll see that. So the first submission that we had was to do with event handlers was from Darth Nihilus, and this is a video of the molder causing it to go sad. So I believe, yep, the toon just walks into the molder, and then that immediately makes the toon go sad. He set up a collision handler for that to run a function to go sad whenever your collision intercepts with the molder's collision. Alright, so I thought that was pretty nice. Pretty good job of showcasing event handlers. This is a screenshot from Professor Renderer. He's recently been working on adding a new toon task. He hasn't exactly been successful yet, but he has seemingly added his own NPC, which I thought was pretty cool. And he's still working on a side toon task. So this right here is a video from Sketched of adding the Lord animation to cogs. So after the cogs get lured, you see they just have that little dazed effect. Now, if I remember what Sketch told me is apparently, I've never looked at the code personally myself, but apparently there is just like a line or two of code that was preventing that animation from ever playing. From my understanding, it was actually pretty easy to add. It was just a big screw up from Disney that... Oh, so that's not the case, Sketched? Oh, okay. Well, regardless, it's pretty cool. And I don't know why Disney didn't use it. Alright, so this next video is from Herb. Herb has been adding a new zone to the game. Specifically a new Cog HQ zone. Right now the models are just the same as Cellbot HQ, but I think it's pretty interesting to show it off nevertheless. So there's a Cog HQ tunnel where the normal tunnel would be, and it brings you to EliteBot HQ, which is just a copy of Self.ground.show HQ pretty much with elite bots. Alright, so this is a little showcase from Little Cat. He didn't really submit anything in the showcase channel, but I needed to fluff this up a little bit, so I added 2 images from Little Cat. Let me just take a sip of water here. Okay, so, well, what's so special about this screenshot? It's just the catalog. Well, maybe I can move to the next screenshot and you'll notice something. You notice anything different about this picture? I'll give you a few seconds. The news, clouds, background, Linux. Captain Fireball is very close. Debug info. That's very close. Alright, I'll stop making everyone guess. This is Toontown Offline running on Python 3.6.8. So Little Cat's been working pretty hard the past few days on converting the game to Python 3. It's been some slow and fast steps. Lots of things in the game are broken, but he's been fixing them up pretty fast. So I think he's been doing a really good job with that. And finally, this is something that I did this week. I actually did this yesterday. So this is sort of related to event handlers, but basically in Toontown Offline during the winter holiday, we have little presents that place themselves around the playgrounds. And you run into the present and then you just get a jelly bean reward. Now, these have already existed a couple years. I just polished them up last night. But how they relate to event handlers is a collision is made around the presents, and when you walk into them, it simply sends an update to the server saying, hey, look, I claimed the present, now give me beans. And it gives you beans. So that's like an example of event handlers being used for something similar to treasures. Triple Pain P said, did I use except once so it doesn't give infinite beans? There is something else you can do aside from except once. You could immediately ignore all messages after you initially collide with the thing. And then that's what I think I did. But nevertheless, it despawns right after you collect it, so that's not a problem anyway. And this is not Tooniversal, this is Toontown Offline. So, great job to anyone in the showcase. If you weren't there, don't fret. Everyone has been submitting some really great stuff in the showcase channel. I did not code something similar for Tooniversal, Darth. Exactly, Triple Pain P. I made it in the showcase, and I have a good meme to represent that. Great job, everyone. This is me giving myself a great job for being in my own showcase. This is me adding myself to the showcase right here. I'm going to screenshot this image and send it because it's pretty good. It needs to be memorialized. Okay, I'll pin it. I just thought it was good for the occasion. Alright, anyways, what are we doing this week? So, this week we are focusing on something Python specific. Last week we kind of focused on something very specific to Panda 3D, which is the event director. Or message handlers, whatever. There's a bunch of different names for it. So this week is very Python specific. Now hold on, before I talk about that. Yeah, so this lesson is kind of just, in a sense, recapping what you've learned so far, but making more sense out of it. So far, I've pretty much just said, type this and you'll get this as a result, or this line of code will do this, but I'm not exactly teaching everyone why you're typing that, and this lesson is going to give a little bit more insight of why you're typing what you're typing when you write out lines of code. It's going to hopefully tie things together better. It's going to be more of a boring lecture, more of a technical one. It's definitely not as visual as the previous lectures. We're only going to be running for maybe like one more hour. It's not going to be a long lecture today. But hopefully it can tie things together really nicely, and maybe this will make a bit more sense to you when things are over. So I also want to say that there is a little survey at the end of the lecture today. We have 3 questions that will decide kind of what we do next week and maybe the week after that, and all weeks after that. So I'm also going to be posting that survey in the announcements channel when I get to that. So yeah, I just wanted to make that clear. If you need to leave before we get to that part in the lecture, then just please check the announcements channel later on today. Okay, so today we are going to be learning about a few recurring things that we've seen so far. So you may have wondered, what the hell is all this def stuff? Def toggle sky, def toggle floor. What does that even mean? Why do you even have that there? Also, you may have noticed that there's a lot of times that this specific word is used. I wonder, can you type that word in the chat that you see recurring in this screenshot? It is used very often in the Toontown source code. Yes, self. Self is used pretty much like so often. Self is pretty much used in almost every variable name that you've seen so far. But why is it like that? Why isn't this variable that I'm pointing to, why isn't self in front of that? Why does it just say sky instead of self.sky? But why does self.ground say self.ground instead of just ground? What's the purpose in doing that? So we're going to be learning a bit today. Darth and Professor have been talking a little bit about it already in the chat, but I'm going to be talking about it to those who are confused. Yeah, so why is it used in many things, but sometimes it's not used? What is self even for? Well, self is used for referencing. There's many different reasons why you would want to use self to reference things. Let me go back to this example where sky does not have the term self before it. Basically, when you put self in front of a variable name, you are referencing it in terms of the entire class. You haven't learned what classes are yet, so just for all intents and purposes, I'm just going to say file, okay? So whenever you type self dot and then a variable name, you're referencing that variable within the entire file, okay? But why do you want to reference it in the entire file? What's the reason? And what does it mean to reference it in the entire file versus something else? Well, one of the reasons is cleanup. And I'm going to give a good example of this here. So this is a screenshot from Toontown Rewritten. This is a guy doing a CJ. And as the Chief Justice is walking to his podium, there are a bunch of fishing docks just seen in Lawbud HQ. There's just a bunch of fishing docks there, and he's like on them. Now this is a result of one of the silly meter features that Toontown Rewritten added. Basically, if the fishing reward wins for the silly meter, what I believe happens is a few extra docks appear out of thin air in several different playgrounds. So in the Berg, I believe there's I believe the docks are doubled, or there's at least a few added to the Berg, just because everyone's going to be fishing. You know, it's going to be so popular that I guess they wanted to make sure there was enough docks, which makes sense. But how did this happen? How did the docks remain in Lawbud HQ when you're no longer in the Berg? That is because they weren't cleaned up properly. Now, I can't say for sure what TTR did or did not do to make this happen, to make them not clean up, but that is what referencing is for. It's for cleaning up. So, I also want to make certain that everyone knows this. Changing zones does not automatically destroy every last thing from the scene graph. That is your job. Alright, so we've done some examples so far where, in Donald's dock, I've spawned a piano, I've spawned an apple, I've made them appear. But I've always made sure that we clean them up afterwards, because if you don't clean up your models, then they're going to pretty much stick with you every time you switch a zone. Now, when I say destroying things from the scene graph is your job, it's not always your job. Of course, there are automatic processes depending on what kind of zone you're in that'll do this for you. For example, if you're working on a zone that uses DNA, it'll automatically clean it up for you, as long as you're adding objects through DNA, and that's a whole nother can of worms. If you're loading a model manually through loader.load model, you're probably going to have to clean that up manually. There are some systems in place that'll do it for you, but most of the time you need to do it manually. So cleanup is not the same for every zone. A COG HQ will clean up differently from a playground. Like I said, playgrounds use DNA, streets use DNA. We've made exceptions to this. For example, spawning the piano and the apple in Donald's dock, that is not done through DNA. We did that manually, which is a way that I typically would not recommend, but cleanup is not the same for every zone. It's located differently. But we're going to give an example of a COG HQ, and we're going to talk about why self is used. So when you define a an object or define a variable or define anything in Python, that is only accessible it is generally only accessible in the function you're defining it in. So at the top here, our function is called load place geom, and this is the function in lawbit.hq that pretty much loads the zone. It loads what you see. It loads the courtyard, and makes sure it sets up the tunnel correctly, just so you can walk through it and there'll be no issues. That's all the function does, and this is ran whenever you enter lawbit.hq. Pretty simple. The bottom function is what happens when you're unloading lawbit.hq. Again, pretty simple, but you cannot reference a variable that was defined in another function unless you prefix it with self. So say for example, instead of self.geom, if I just called it geom, that would work. That would load the model perfectly fine. The issue would lie in unloading, because you cannot reference any variable name that does not have self prefixing it. Yeah, Awu just gave a very good example. For example, br link tunnel. This is referencing a tunnel node. It's used for going in and out of tunnels. Say you wanted to use this in a different function, you would not be able to use it unless you prefixed it with self. So we would have to make it self.brLinkTunnel. So that is why we use self in terms of cleaning things up. So this unload function pretty much says if the geometry is loaded, then delete it and set it to nothing. And that's what cleans up the lawbit.hq zone. And people have been providing examples of corporate clash not cleaning up properly sometimes. For example, with the counterclaim building, or NPCs, or Toontown. All examples of not cleaning up. They may stem from different reasons, to be fair. But yeah. So this is why, without self, you can only reference it from the function that you define something in. Unless it's not defined in a function at all. But I wouldn't worry about that for now, because all the work you've been doing so far has been defining stuff within functions. Yeah, a good example is the jukebox in Toontown Apex. It would stick with you whenever you switch zones. Alright, so are there any questions about this? Is anyone confused? Is everyone good? Yeah, instead of is anyone confused, I should ask, is everyone good? Ben, how is your day? I'm running on a few hours of sleep. I'm probably gonna go to sleep after the lecture, but I'm doing good aside from that. Alright, so as long as there are no questions, then hopefully everyone understands why we use self in that context. So what's another use for prefixing things with self? Another use is for checks, making checks for things. So what are checks? Let me give you a good example. When you load into, again, lawbit.hq, when it at some point along the process of loading you in, I'm not sure what specific point it is, it'll eventually load the lawbit.hq model, right? But say for example you were lagging a little bit for whatever reason. I don't know. Let's just say you were lagging. And let's say this was Toontown rewritten, actually. Yeah, let's say this was Toontown rewritten. And let's say as you were loading into lawbit.hq, the district draining feature needs to drain that district that you're currently in for whatever reason. And it immediately tries to yeet you out of that district as fast as you can. And you're currently loading lawbit.hq. You're loading self.geom. But it hasn't loaded yet. But you're leaving the zone before it loads. Well, whenever you leave the zone, this function is called. unload place geom, and that pretty much unloads the model for you. It unloads the lolbit.hq model. Well, that's not good, because if you haven't even managed to load it yet and you're trying to unload it, then you're going to crash. Because if you try to clean up something that has not yet been loaded, that'll crash your game. Self.geom.remove node is the function that pretty much cleans up your model for you. So if you pretty much remove the node that before it even exists, your game will simply crash. Mr. Dr. Professor Awu, which example are you talking about? I don't even want to think about transformations ever again. That code makes my head hurt. But yeah, so what self is also used for is for checks. So you might have noticed at the top here, I circled it in cyan, if self.geom. This pretty much is saying, well, if self.geom exists, then do anything underneath the if statement. So if the geometry exists, then remove the node and set it to none. So that makes sure that it'll only clean it up if it's already been loaded. Because if the model hasn't been loaded, you don't want to clean it up, you're going to crash. That is what this if statement is for. And that is also why self is used. Because, well, if you haven't loaded the model yet, then you need some way of checking that it hasn't been loaded. So in the init function of any class or any file, I'll just refer to file for now, because not everyone will really understand what a class is. That'll be for a later lecture. But there's a function called init, and that is in pretty much every single file. And I believe this is what runs first when you first load up the file. And you can see I highlighted it in blue here. I made a variable called self.geom, but I've equaled it to none. Why have I equaled it to none? Well, if you don't have a variable defined under that name, but you're trying to reference it, you're going to crash. So for example, when it unloads the zone, it checks to see if self.geom exists. And if it does, then you can clean it up, you can delete that model, you're good to go, everything's fine and dandy. But if I don't define it first at the top here, then it can never get defined if it's never loaded. And if you try to reference something that doesn't exist, then it's going to crash. Are there any questions on that? Hopefully I explained it somewhat okay. What's the difference between init and load functions? Init automatically happens at the begin, like when the file's generated. But load is simply something that's manually run. If you remove the node, then why do you have to make it equal none? That's simply normal etiquette. That is simply just normal clean up etiquette. That's also so any remnants of the model are just non-existent. Yeah, it helps with memory, because you're not referencing anything. So are there any other questions, or is everyone good? Because this can be a confusing concept, but hopefully you guys can get it. Alright, awesome. Oh, I'm gonna wait till everyone's done typing. Let me just take a sip of water. Everyone's typing. Alright, I'm just going to move on. So, we're also going to be talking about functions. Because so far, I've kind of just said, here's a function, here's just copy paste this, and you can make one. But we've never really explained why we do certain things in functions. So let me just talk about that. So what are arguments? Arguments are pieces of information that you supply a function. We use that term when referring to magic words also. So for example, if you use the magic word HP, and then you type in a number after that, that number is considered an argument. So if you type in HP -1, that'll set your laugh points to -1. It'll make you go sad. If you type in HP 137, then 137 is the argument, and it'll set your laugh points to 137. Hunter Boppin said, "Did you cut off or just not talking?" Can everyone else hear me? Let me move Hunter Boppin out and back in. I'm just going to continue on here. Yeah, so magic words are, again, a good example. But there can be more arguments than just one. There can be several. What's a magic word with a few arguments that you could use? You could use the transformation commands. Or set SOS. Set SOS is also a really good example. I forgot which order it's in, but I think you type set SOS, and then there's two arguments. There's the name of the SOS card, and there's the quantity of SOS cards that you want. Start Invasion also has several arguments. I forgot what they are, but they exist. So arguments are just information that you supply to a function. Sketched, it does not break it. You just need to conjoin the names and it'll work. At least on offline. It may not be like that on Schoolhouse, but yes. So I'm gonna be talking about arguments with last week's example. Oh, and another example that someone already talked about is an example of arguments would be the set position function. We've used that many times. Or set scale, or set HPR. We've used those several times when talking about the scene graph. If you're setting the position to 0, 0, 0, 0 is an argument, the second 0 is an argument, and the third 0 is also an argument. They are the X, Y, and Z coordinates. So set position, those are three arguments right there. So this picture is a little bit of code that we did last week. And pretty much right at the bottom here where the arrow points to, that line of code toggles the visibility of the floor when you touch it. This is something we looked at last week. It was pretty fun. Whenever you would jump, the floor would become invisible, and then it would become visible again. It was pretty simple, pretty good. But I'm going to change this code up a bit and use just a simple function and use arguments with it. So I went ahead and I changed it. So instead of self.accept, I removed the event handler and I instead run one function a single time. And what this function does is it'll toggle the visibility one single time. It won't take any input. It'll just toggle it once. Now, what I did is I changed up the function a little bit. So the function looks like this. This is a basic function. At the beginning of a function, you need to put the term def. That is how Python knows you're defining a function. Def, I guess, stands for defining. And then after def, you just need to type in the name of whatever your function is. Your name can be almost everything. I've said this a few times in previous lectures. There are a very little amount of restraints. For example, don't name your function something like a name that already is being used in your file. It's not good. Don't name your function self. Don't name your function def. So you can't just type def. That'd be really stupid. Do not do that. There are a few exceptions to what you cannot name it. Do not name it if. Do not name it else. Generally, don't name it anything that PyCharm will highlight in orange or purple. So as you can see, def, if, else, not, they're all orange. Do not name any variables or functions anything you see in orange. Do not name it self. That is in purple. Do not name it self. So yeah, don't name it keywords that Python uses. Yeah, and don't name your functions the same as other functions in the same file. What if you don't name it? You have to name it or else you're fucked. Now, after you type in the name, you need to type parentheses. And pretty much you should put the word self in there. That way you can reference this function in any other of the functions that you already have. That is why we put the keyword self inside of the parentheses. And then underneath the function is just whatever code you want to have happen when the function's ran. That's how simple it is. So in this example, it toggles the floor hidden, and then if the floor is hidden, it'll go ahead and hide it. If not, it'll go ahead and show it. Pretty simple function. So are there any questions on this function right here? Let me just take a sip of water. No, you cannot name your functions emojis. What if you do? Good luck crashing. Okay, so as long as there aren't any other questions with this function, unless did Deputy Wacko have a question on it? Can you use those words in orange text, but like in more than one word? Yes. So say for example, you wanted to name your function if, else, not. Have a field day with that. Merry Christmas. You can use that. You can combine keywords and generally it'll be fine. Yeah, it's better to name functions appropriately, so you're generally not ever going to do that. I mean, theoretically you could, but should I teach my students how to proper format? Everyone will have their own way of doing things, their own way of naming things. That's up for them to decide. Generally, what I use is camel case. What's camel case? This is a good example. This function here is named toggle floor. The F is capitalized, but the T at the beginning is not capitalized. That's what camel case is. You start out small, and then for each word, you capitalize the first letter. It makes it much easier to read. You don't have to do that, but it's general etiquette. It's a good etiquette. You see that I don't like what Triple Pane P did. That's like a nasty function name. I like starting it out lowercase. Oh yeah, you can do underscores to separate your words, but yeah, Python is typically camel case. Okay, so let me give an example with arguments. So again, this is that same bit of code I showed earlier, but instead I've edited the function a little bit so it passes through the true argument. So this will toggle the floor visibility to true when this function is ran. So let's have a look at this function. It has changed quite a bit. So now, after the term self in purple, I added a comma, and then I added a variable name. Now, this variable name can also be pretty much anything. You can name it anything you want within reason, just like the function name. Again, don't be stupid. Don't name it self. So you don't have two selves. Don't name it def. Just name it, within reason, as we've been saying so far. It's just pretty much whatever you want to do to refer to it. Something else. I'm missing something here. Oh yeah, I screwed that up. I'll talk about that in a second though. So when you're expecting information to be passed through to the function, you need to add as many arguments as you expect. So because this is a simple one argument function, whether you enable it or you disable it, there's only one argument involved. Sketched, are you going to talk about the default values for args? Not today. Keeping it simple today. That's good if you can feel like you can teach this lesson. If you have this understanding already, then that's great. So pretty much what this function will do is it'll check that if state, and this is just a simplified way of saying if state equals true, then it'll show the ground. And if it's not true, then it'll do this. Now, this should say self.ground.hide, but I accidentally typed show. But what this should do is hide the ground if state equals false, and show it if state equals true. Typing if state is just a simpler way of checking if something's true or not. You could as equally as just type something such as if state equals true, or if state equals true. And that is pretty much how you pass arguments through to functions. So are there any questions before we move on to our break? Several people are typing. Could I give another quick summary of what self does? Sure thing. Let me go back a little bit. Oops, no, not that. So self is used for several different things. But basically what it does is by prefixing your variable name with self, you're making that variable accessible to anywhere in your file. Anywhere in the class, anywhere in the file pretty much. I'll explain the difference between class and file in a later lecture. But pretty much just think of it as prefixing a variable name with self makes it available anywhere. If you do not prefix it with self, then your variable will only be available in the function that you're currently working in. Which is why, let me give an example. Can I give an, yeah. Which is why, for example, sky, in this example of finding the lawbot sky, because last week what we did is we made the sky spin around and around and around. I did not prefix it with self because I don't need to reference this specific node anywhere else in the code. That's why I did not prefix it with self. The reason you prefix stuff with self is to reference something that exists elsewhere, outside of your current function. Now, the reason why you may prefix a function with self, because, for example, self.floorHidden, that's just a variable. That's just something that you're creating. But self.accept is actually a function. Uh, accept is a function just like load place geom is a function, or unload place geom is a function. You prefix functions with self if there are functions that exist outside of your current function. You can, I forgot what the word is. You can have a function within a function, but that gets a little bit messy. I don't worry about that for now. It's rarely used. Disney only uses that a few times. But pretty much you have to reference all other functions with self just so you can even use it. So, are there any other questions? When is Break the Law coming out? I don't know, but Tubby told me he couldn't make today's lecture because he was helping to test it. So, I guess that says something. Alright, so as long as there's no other questions, we're going to go on a 10-minute break. So I'm going to start talking again at 7:05 Eastern time. So do whatever you want until then. I'm just going to relax for a few minutes. We should probably do the level editor afterwards. Yes, Herb. As always, I'm always around for 30 minutes after the lectures end, which is time that I can use to help you with any of your issues. What? Oh, nice. Deputy Wacko, even I've had trouble doing that before. Even I'm still not 100% sure how to do that. So I don't think I'll be able to help you much with that. I'm assuming if I wanted to find collisions, I need to use Maya if they aren't specified in the Panda view. They will be specified in the Panda view, but depending on what model you're working with, It might be pretty hard to find the name of it. Ben, what simple programming mistake has costed you a lot of time? Um, I don't know. I don't know. I'd have to think about that quite a lot. I mean, do you mean like a universal generalized mistake, or do you mean a very specific issue? And the Toontown Outskirts is not a custom model. It's simply DNA. That's it. Generalized mistake. The only one I can think of is when I first started developing Toontown stuff, and I used Notepad++. And when I would go on a new line, it would indent it with tabs instead of spaces, and Python hates that. They hate tabs. You'll crash because of indentation errors, and it is not fun. So luckily, I set all you guys up with an IDE where you don't have to deal with that bullshit. You have PyCharm, and PyCharm, you guessed it, is focused around Python. So it likes to try to help you with Python wherever it can. So back when I first started out, I had a lot of aneurysms dealing with indentation errors because of Notepad++. Your PyCharm says it has an update. Do you update it? If you want to, doesn't matter. Ben, how can I remove genders in Toontown? I don't know. I've never looked at that code before. There's probably a lot of things you'd have to do. You'd have to remove the interface when you select a gender. You'd have to remove the differences in clothing. That's a lot of work to do. And also, how would you, like, I bet lots of people would still want to be able to toggle whether they had eyelashes or not. So you'd have to add some sort of new interface to toggle on and off eyelashes, to toggle on and off skirts. You have to add a lot of new interfaces and like go in and like strip out the old. Okay. It is now 7:05 Eastern, so we're going to move on here to the end of the lecture. So, I have a survey that I talked about earlier that I want everyone to respond to. It's very simple. There's just 3 links to straw poll. Just 3 questions. I'm going to paste these in announcements right now, so just bear with me a second as I copy them and put them in announcements. And you can go and click on them and fill them out when I ping everyone in just a second here. Alright, there we go. I just pinged everyone in the announcements channel. If you want to go ahead and click on all of them. Let me unembed them actually, because that kind of, those embeds kind of push all of them to the top. That doesn't look that good. Okay. There we go. They're unembedded now. Can I introduce nap times to class? Nah. I'm just going to open up these 3 straw polls and see what the responses are. I'm not going to make a decision based on what we see from them today. I'm going to wait until tomorrow because some people may vote on it who aren't necessarily attending the lecture today. I spelled implementing wrong. Oh, boo-hoo. Yeah, so I'm just going to wait a few minutes for everyone to vote on that if they haven't already. It seems mostly everyone in the voice call right now has. Alright, so it seems like the majority does not want lectures to be moved from Saturdays to Sundays. Again, I'm going to wait until tomorrow, until more people can vote. But that's how it is right now. Most people do want to have lecture next week before Christmas, which would be on the 21st, if we do. And it seems the majority want to have fun implementing a small feature requested by the students. When I wrote that, I actually mean myself implementing a feature upon everyone's request. Not everyone implementing a small feature themselves. But okay, I think that's good for the polls right now. I'll check on them again sometime tomorrow. And I'll let everyone know what we'll be doing based off of them. Alright, let me go back into present mode. What would the feature be? It would be something that everyone would vote on that we could add. Okay, so I'm going to be giving an official update on assignments. So as it stands right now, this is going to be our 6th assignment so far. And I think only like four of them we've actually had stuff being done. So what I've come to realize is that having to grade everyone's assignments is really ambitious. and my schedule definitely does not allow for it, nor does any of the other teachers' schedules allow for it. So we're gonna be keeping assignments, but I'm gonna be removing the expectation of reviewing them. Unfortunately, we simply don't have time to review like 15 or 15 or 20 different assignments every week. It's just a lot, especially if we want to like provide a really good and detailed critique of it. Darth said, why not a peer review? We could do that in the future if that's very popular. But what I'm saying for now is that you should not expect to see any official review from the teachers. For now, assignments are just, again, as they always kind of happen, for your own interest and for your own practice, really. We're going to keep doing them, but at the beginning of the course, I stated that we'd be doing reviews and we have due dates for them. I'm going to be throwing all that out the window for now, just because there's not time for it. I could introduce a peer review later. I'll think about that until next week, and I might make a decision on that next week. But for now, I'm just like making it aware that these are only for your own practice. They always have been, but you will not be getting reviewed unless you specifically have a problem. Like if you are having a problem working on something, of course, as you always have been able to, feel free to message me. Feel free to talk in bug reports. That is not changing. If you need help will still be available. We're just not going to go out of our way to review all of the assignments because it's just too much work. With that being said, I have the assignment for this week. So what is the assignment for this week? Drum roll, please. The assignment is to play Toontown Offline and Toontown Corporate Clash for at least 8 hours a day each for the next week. No, I'm just fucking with you. There is no assignment this week. Today was more of a technical lecture, so just keep practicing what you've learned so far in whatever way fits you. Again, please take the surveys linked earlier so we can decide what we're doing moving forward. I really tried to think of something to do, but you did learn something new, but you didn't learn anything new to apply. Aside from arguments, I guess, but we've kind of been doing that already. Today was a day to make sense out of some things that you've already learned, that you've already been seeing. Like, what the fuck does self mean? What does def mean? Hopefully some of these things make a lot more sense now. How am I supposed to play Clash when I can barely walk down the streets scraping off 1 FPS? Well, don't worry. If you can't play Clash, then you can substitute your hours. So you can play 16 hours of offline or 0 hours of Clash, or 0 hours of offline and 16 hours of Clash. You can mix and match your assignment this week. You can play 1 hour of Toontown Offline and 15 hours of Corporate Clash. But anyways, so that is this week's assignment, and with that is a wrap for this week. So thank you all for attending today's lecture. I'm going to be here 30 minutes for 30 more minutes, so I'm going to be leaving at 7:45 Eastern. I'll still be here for any questions that anyone may have, but aside from that, that's the end of today's lecture. Thanks for coming out.